yet, but we're going to keep working on that. We miss your pretty face, Brock, but we'll get by without it for another episode. We are talking today about the sacraments. We're in the midst of reading the Oxford Handbook of Reformed Theology, and we've been in the section that deals with a number of different theological issues. We talked about covenant last time, and there have been a number of other interesting chapters. The divine decree was one in this section, prolegomena. But today we're going to talk a little bit about the sacraments. And this chapter is written by Martha Moore Keish, who teaches at Columbia Theological Seminary in Decatur, Georgia. Right before we got started, I said to Brock, I'd never heard of that seminary. And so, Brock, you looked it up, and it's a Presbyterian seminary affiliated with the Presbyterian Church USA. And so she has an interest in the sacraments and in a number of issues. It's sort of in the Reformed world. Also a scholar of Karl Barth, and as we go through some of these discussions, we'll have to see whether there's any impact of that in any of what she has written here. But the sacraments, I think, are an interesting topic to talk about for a number of reasons. One is that in the Reformed world, there are different views of the sacraments, and both just simply some of the theological issues around baptism, for example, but also even just somewhat different views about are they merely symbolic? Is there what does it mean that they're in my own denomination? We always talk about them as being signs and seals, and what does that seals part mean? And so there is a little bit of variety in the Reformed world on these things. And then another reason why it's interesting to be talking about the sacraments right now is it seems like there is a growth in interest in the sacraments, and how do we engage with the sacraments as part of the worship service? For many, many years, in the Reformed world, we were really focused, and we still make it central on the sermon, the preaching of the word. But sacraments have also been a really important part of the liturgy, especially at certain times in Reformed history. John Calvin had communion every Sunday. And to some extent, I don't know if this is true in all Reformed traditions, but I think generally many of the sort of sub-traditions within the Reformed tradition tend to be somewhat low church, maybe, at least not super high church like Anglicans are. And as a result of that, at least in the last maybe, I don't know whether it's 100 years or a period of time, interest in the sacraments has been somewhat less. It's not that we've forgotten about them by any means. It's always been an important part. But discussion of how often do we participate in the sacraments? What do they actually mean? How do we really make this a part of who we are? And in my own denomination, many years ago, when the official title of a pastor in the Dutch language was a minister of the word and sacrament, however you would say that in Dutch. And when they started primarily moving to the English language in the last, in some places it was over 100 years ago, in other places it's closer to 80 or 90 years ago. Even a little bit less in some areas, Canada far less. The term in English was just simply minister of the word, and so in our system, you can be ordained to be a minister of the word, and there are some other ordinations that are not quite to the level of minister of the word. We have ministry associates, we have licensure, things like that, but the full on ordination is as minister of the word. And there's been some discussion about changing that title to minister of word and sacrament, partly to deal with the idea that, hey, sacrament is an important part of what we do in worship, and partly also to again show that there is some difference here in our tradition. For example, I'm licensed to preach in Classis, Wisconsin of the Christian Reformed Church, but being licensed doesn't mean that I can perform the sacraments. So I can go to a church and preach the word, but I can't do the sacraments. That's held out only for those who are ordained as ministers of the word. And that's interesting again because that sort of flips a little bit on the head the idea that, oh, the sacraments, we haven't thought about them as much, because there still is this idea that, well, okay, we'll let you preach, but we're not going to let you do the sacraments, which is interesting. And as we sort of think about some of the history issues and then later some of the contemporary debates, it'll be interesting to think about how some of that has ebbed and flowed over the years, and where are we headed to now. So, Brock, before we really get started with biblical and early church roots and then 16th century emergence of a Reformed tradition, I just kind of want to get your thoughts. What your thoughts on what did you think that when we decided we were going to read a chapter on the sacraments, and what were kind of the issues that you were looking for, and then maybe we'll also get to talk a little bit about whether those issues were actually covered in this chapter. Any thoughts?
Yeah, my friend, thank you. Is a very enjoyable topic for me because so many secondary issues of discussion today turn into primary issues. People anathematize each other over, for example, the young earth creation versus old earth creation. It's very common in my tribe for the young earthers to say, if you're not young earth, you've missed a primary doctrine. And other topics are like that as well. This is a highly, I'm trying to think of the right word here. This is a highly individualized situation where people feel free to anathematize brothers and sisters who, even 50 years ago, let alone 100 years ago, it was understood in the essentials remain solid, and in the non-essentials, grace and charity. So the sacraments is one of those topics where people can still have strong opinions and strong positions, but perhaps we're not moving as aggressively towards the anathematizing and the verbal violence and the, shedding of theological bloodshed, figuratively speaking. So I like this topic for that. The other reason why I like this topic is, if you show me where you are around the sacraments, very often it will show me where you're at in some of the fundamentals of your theology. So one example, the sacrament of penance was very different in the early Middle Ages than it is today. It was linked with baptism. Very oftentimes in some of the early church, I should say early Middle Age church, in the early Middle Ages, people would, because of their view of the sacrament of baptism and its character and nature, people would delay getting baptized because they thought you could only get baptized once. And if you sinned after your baptism, well, then you've gone and spoilt your perfect, forgiven situation. And now you're potentially ready for HE double toothpicks again. And so, you had situations where uh, particularly successful, influential men would be patrons of the church, and they would almost be members, but they would delay membership, and they would seek to have this sort of deathbed baptism. And that's because of the way they saw the sacraments. Now, that would seem very foreign to us today because, Chuck, you and I, from our tradition, we understand what's called, we have an evangelical understanding of the nature of the gospel. I ask people all the time, when people use the word evangelical, what do they mean? And almost no one really has a technical theological distinction. People might say, oh, well, it means that you're conservative in your outlook, or it means that you're closely associated with fundamentalists. And these things are moderately true. But really, there's a particular understanding that the evangelical view of the gospel is in sharp contrast, relief, or distinction against what's been called a traditional sacerdotal view of the church. Now, in sacerdotalism, you have a priestly class. You have a special elite educated class, the clergy, and they are granted and entrusted with, quote unquote, the keys to the kingdom. What's that verse? I think Matthew 16:19. I will give you keys to the kingdom of heaven. Whatsoever you shall bind on earth shall be bound in heaven. And whatsoever you loose on earth shall be loosed in heaven. It says in Matthew 18:18, whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven. Whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven. It even says in John 20:23, if you forgive anyone his sins, they are forgiven. If you withhold forgiveness from anyone, it is withheld. And so for a long time in the church, the sacerdotal view invested this special clerical class with the quote unquote keys to the kingdom, this sacerdotalism. And so the clergy became ministers, um, in the sense that they became sort of like, an authorized reseller or an authorized dealer might be in a corporate sense today. You go and you say, boy, I'd like to buy a car from Ford Motor Company, or I'd like to buy a car from Toyota. Well, you can't go to Ford Motor Company directly and purchase a car, or you can't go to Toyota directly. But what you do is you go to the authorized resellers. We call them dealers. And those dealers are imbued. They have a special license. They have a special permission to dispense the vehicles. And, I don't mean that in a crass sense, but that is somewhat the model behind the sacerdotal view. There are designated people in a priestly class, and when they administer these ordinances, and we'll have to talk about the name and number of those ordinances, when they administer those, then just like the dealer, when you go to purchase your car, there's a special relationship, and that dealer is able to do the things necessary so that when you fulfill the dealer's conditions, the dealer gets you the vehicle. And of course, as an evangelical, we look to a different model than this. So the sacerdotal model is very common and popular in the early Middle Ages, up through the Middle Ages, and still is the default understanding in the Roman Catholic Church today. And that's why, for example, with perhaps only a few exceptions, Protestant churches don't have priests, because priests are typically associated with being in this clerical class and having these special dispensary powers. And that's why you don't have pastors in your Roman Catholic Church, because pastors, in the Protestant Reformation, the Protestants uh, said that they believe in another view based on what's called the priesthood of believers. And you can go into the book of Hebrews and you can see you are a royal priesthood, a priesthood of believers. So there's no special, unique, designated class. Just anybody can tell anybody about the gospel. Just anybody can, in theory, and I mean this in the best way, baptize another person or administer the Lord's Supper. So, for example, in Protestant churches today, you can dispense the bread and the drink, and without any special training, without any special accreditation. And that's because there's an entirely different underpinning or substructure about what's really actually happening when these sacraments are performed, when the administrations occur. So going through that and seeing what people think and why is is crucial and important. And I'll give an example. It's not so popular today, Chuck, but when you and I were young, when we were boys, and you played war and you played soldier, what did every troop have? Every troop had its own flag, its own colors. And one of the quote unquote rules of being a soldier was nobody could touch your colors. Nobody could mess with your colors. No one could steal or take or put their hand on your colors, because that symbolized a loss. If you allowed that to happen as a troop, you would very often in the military, you would be disbanded. You were no longer a soldier. You were no longer a member of that company. And so many people in the World War II generation felt the same about the American flag. And so um, today, of course, we have moved away from that substantially. There are a lot of people who think, well, it's not all that special. It's just cloth. And even among veterans, there are people who say, well, there's nothing special about the cloth. It's just a symbol, of a memorial honoring the people who shed their blood to keep the country safe and free. But if you remember just 50 years ago when we were young, and of course it was even more true before us in generations, people would be rabid about flag treatment. And that is somewhat of a modern similar analog or token that really goes with what's happening in the church with these sacraments. So that was a long-winded way to sort of open that up and bring it up. I'll give you another modern example of a token that's associated, and that would, of course, be a wedding ring. So, when a husband and a wife pledge their troth, I think the old word was plight troth. when they would do that formal thing, that had meaning. It was investing the ring with what was thought to be a spiritual significance. Today, just any old ring. And I don't mean that flippantly, because, of course, people have sentimental attachments. Husbands and wives, they're sentimentally attached to the ring that they got married in. But the truth is, if it was lost, it wasn't, it's not typically the end of the world. But even just recently, Victorian times and up into the last century, it was a token, it was a symbol that was even stronger than just memorialism. So Getting to talk to people about these things really helps open up what they think is happening in the process of salvation. By the way, who is doing the saving if you have a clerical class versus if you don't have a clerical class? So, in the evangelical circles where you and I are in, Chuck, we don't sweat administering the ordinances particularly much. I mean, we don't try to abuse them, but because we have a view that it is God, it was the Holy Spirit moving in this earth who dispenses grace, who is the means by which things happen. People are saved because the Holy Spirit moves and acts in their life, not because a specially trained and designated priest turns the crank on a ritual. And so that can explain why so many people have such wildly different theologies than we do. Now, Chuck, how was it sort of in your history growing up? How did you view it with others? You know, the Roman Catholic Church is, of course, the classic counterexample to the probably to the way that you grew up and understood things. You know, when you were first learning about things, how did the sacraments help you? How did the sacraments potentially confuse you? And where did you go from there?
Yeah, so kind of a funny story. So my mom had grown up Roman Catholic and became Protestant and Reformed when she met my dad, who was only recently had become a Christian, but they started attending an Orthodox Presbyterian church and eventually the Christian Reformed church after they got married and moved to Connecticut first, and so my mom, while she certainly accepted and still today accepts the Reformed view on things like the sacraments, there was certainly sort of it impacted her. She was a pretty devout little girl. She tells stories about how she would go in the morning to mass nearly every school day, and her parents never did that. Um, and she would get up early just so that she could go, and she tells stories about like during Lent standing for hours with her hands out because she thought that was a way of penance. But anyway, given that in that tradition, in the Catholic tradition, there is something more. The bread is actually, they believe that it actually transforms and becomes Christ's body. And so they treat it with a great deal of respect because since it's Christ's body, that's why they wipe up all the crumbs. The priests eat all the remaining bread if there's any left over. They're very careful with it. And I remember one time, I don't know how old I was. I was probably 6 or 7, and we had communion at our church at North Haledon Christian Reformed Church in North Haledon, New Jersey, and I remember realizing we were going to have communion, and as often happened, as the communion would happen after the sermon, and as often happened, my mom would often have cough drops with her in church, and I remember during the sermon asking for a cough drop, and so she handed me a cough drop, and I, hid it in my hand. She thought I had, eaten it right away, and I hid it in my hand, and waited until communion came. And then and in our tradition, typically what would always happen is there was a plate with the bread and a plate with the wine, and they would just pass the plates just like passing offering plates, and everybody would take the bread, everybody would take a little cup of wine or juice and hold on to it, and then when everybody had it, then the pastor would say, take, eat, remember, and believe, etc., and eat the bread, and then same thing with the cup. And I had held on to that cough drop so that when everybody else ate the bread, I put the cough drop in my mouth. And my mom saw me do that, and she didn't know. It was one of the first time that I realized that adults and parents are actually people too, because I could tell she couldn't tell whether to be really mad at me because this seemed really sacrilegious to her growing up as a Roman Catholic, or whether it was hilariously funny, which I'm sure it was, and people around me laughed. So the other people in church laughed, or how to take it. And I just remember watching her sort of in just a few seconds go from being like, don't do that, to but also kind of like, ha, 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 and that was really the first time I really even thought about, well, why did she sort of go back and forth? Why was it in some ways funny, but why was it also like, you know, it's just like, what just happened here? And she explained to me later that day, well, first of all, and growing up as a Catholic, we wouldn't even have touched the bread. The priest would place it on your tongue. And so even this was new to me. But then the fact that you turned a cough drop into the bread, which as Catholics we believe that was the body of Christ, that just kind of took me aback. That was like, that just seemed like, oh, that's really wrong. And she said, but I also know that it wasn't. We see it a little bit more as a symbol, a seal, and we don't believe that it actually physically becomes the body of Christ. We believe that Christ is present with us, but it's not even like the Lutherans do. Well, and she wasn't going into that great deal of explanation at that point. But she's trying to explain it to me, and it was like, okay, this is interesting. And so then over the years, just between baptisms and communion, was just really always interested in how do we do it and why do we do it that way. One thing that always happened as a kid, and this I should ask more people whether this is a tradition in a lot of their churches, or whether it's just I went to a bunch of churches that all had the same tradition. But in the church that I was in at that age, and then in the church I was in as a teenager in Iowa, the church that I went to as a young adult in another part of Wisconsin, and then the church that I've been a member of now here for nearly 30 years as an adult, we have this tradition that when a baby is baptized, the pastor shortly before the baptism and after he's gone through some of the teachings and some of the forms for the baptism, he will invite all the small children up. And so that was a thing. I remember going up and watching, the little kids always got to be up front and have a front and center seat for the baptism of a new baby in church. Um, and just kind of thinking about, well, why did we do that? And then but every pastor would always kind of do some things a little bit differently, and we would talk about, well, Pastor Rob, he used to use a lot of water, and oh, Pastor Rick uses a lot of water too. But Pastor Rick will also, when he's explaining this to the kids, he'll even splash a little bit of water on the kids, and to get them to understand what's happening here, what this water is. And that's interesting. And then the same thing with communion. For many many years, it seemed like most of the time, it was just simply this: pass the plates, grab it, and then hold on to it until the time that the pastor says the words that take and eat, take and drink. But occasionally we would try something new. I remember being in high school, and the church that I attended from when I lived in Iowa, from when I was in junior high all the way until I got married right after college, that church had a lot of college students. We lived in a college town. My parents taught at a college, and our church often was one of the ones that a lot of students attended. It would kind of ebb and flow from year to year, but we often had a lot of students. And a couple of things that I remember from that time. I remember one time we decided, instead of just passing the plates, is they had everybody stand up, and we all got into circles of about 8 or 10 people, and each circle got a kind of a small loaf of bread, and we were instructed to take a piece from the loaf, and then we would eat it together when the pastor said, the words of communion. And I remember there was a college student, so she was only a few years older than me. Um, but we used to joke about how the college students were always hungry. Well, she kind of proved it because she took this huge hunk. Like she had this much bread in her hand when she took it, and me and my friends were kind of standing next to each other. It must have been an evening service, because if it was a morning service I would have been by my parents, but in the evening we were always allowed to sit with our friends. So it must have been an evening service when we did it. But I remember kind of like nudging my friends, and we were kind of laughing about how much bread this young woman took. And then, of course, when it was time to take and eat, she put too much in her mouth, tried to swallow it all at once, and she started coughing. And of course, us high school kids thought this was just hilarious. But then again, that got me to thinking about, well, why do we usually do things that way, and why do we do things a little bit differently here? And we've been thinking about that actually in our congregation now. We have moved to um, First of all, we've moved to doing communion much more often. Traditionally, in the Christian Reformed Church, it was done 6 times a year. Five of those were typically, well, four of those were typically just on Sundays quarterly, and then typically there was Good Friday or Maundy Thursday. One of them was done, and then typically there was also another, usually around Thanksgiving. There was one. But we've gone to doing it once a month, and our elders are talking about doing it more often than that yet. And we've also gone to more of a system where everybody walks up front, and the elders are up front when the pastor says the words of commission, and then everybody walks up, and one elder will hold out the plate with the bread and say, this is the body of Christ broken for you. And another elder will have the juice in front of her, and will say, this is the blood of Christ shed for you. And we one at a time go up there and take it, and then move on. And that's a different way. And when we started doing it that way, there were some people who were like, why are we changing? What, and why can't we ever go back? And now, I think now if we tried to go back to the old way, people would be like, why are we changing? Why are we going back? But it's interesting to think about those things, and what do they mean to us, and why do we have these traditions around how we partake in the sacraments, and what does it mean? Uh, what is the meaningfulness of it? One issue that I know our elders have been talking a little bit about with regard to communion, in the Dutch Reformed tradition, where communion was not as often, there also was a tradition that the Sunday before communion was preparatory Sunday, and there was a preparatory form that was read, and the idea was, now you need to go prepare, and this week you need to be especially preparing for the Lord's Supper. And people kind of took that to being, oh, you better be good. You better really be good this week. Don't sin this week, because if you take communion, it might be a curse to you instead of a blessing. And we're like, and I know our elders have I was part of some of those discussions while I was during my most recent term as an elder. And we talked about, well, there's a good purpose for preparatory, but have we gotten almost too much into turning it into more of a magic trick? Or have we turned it more into, you have to measure up before you can take communion, versus what it really is a sign of grace? And so thinking about some of those things, and so we've eliminated the preparatory portion of it. And again, when that first happened, there were some people who were really upset by that, because they were very used to that. And that was, and to be fair, in our Dutch Reformed tradition, that was very much a part of it. I think technically we might even be in violation of church order by not doing that. but we've chosen to think of um, communion, and because we do it a little bit more often as well, as being more of a symbol of grace than something that we do because we feel like we've been good. And but all of those things also get into a number of the issues that get raised um, over the years, and over the years how people have thought about the sacraments. And so, Brock, I kind of wanted to, just start maybe here at the beginning of the chapter and to talk about some of the earlier uh, ways that people thought about the sacraments. And it's interesting um, that she immediately begins and says, "Hey, look, if any discussion of Reformed sacramental theology has to begin with Scripture, of course that's correct." And she talks about how in the Vulgate, the Latin language version of the Bible that was used um, in early times and continued in use for many years in the Catholic tradition as well, that there is this word sacramentum that referred first to God's hidden plan for salvation, but then connected this with the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. And so the word sacrament had somewhat of a broader meaning here. And then Tertullian began to apply the word sacramentum to certain church practices, especially baptism and the Lord's Supper. And so that's the second century, and we start to see sort of thinking of sacraments as being very specific things that happen in the church. Augustine, though, had this definition of sacrament as a visible sign of an invisible grace. And I really like that definition, a visible sign of an invisible grace. But of course, that's a definition that can be fairly broad. And Augustine himself recognized that that term applied in some ways not just to baptism and the Lord's Supper, but to things like the creeds and the Lord's Supper and marriage, and even signs like the rainbow in the story of Noah. And so this word sacrament got used to refer to a range of actions and signs, and only over time did it become more restricted. And eventually, the Catholic Church declared in the 12th century through Peter Lombard that there were 7 official sacraments: baptism, confirmation, Eucharist, penance, extreme unction, orders, and matrimony. And so you kind of have over time. This is not a matter of the early church did something in a particular way and then we're done. But this is something that has evolved over time. So even the fact that the reformers in the 16th century made some changes. Well, they were only a few centuries from Peter Lombard declaring what the 7 sacraments were, and there was much more time where this idea of what a sacrament was a little more amorphous and a little larger. Um, and I found that to be interesting. I knew that there had been, that's not to say that people didn't have the Lord's Supper, people didn't have baptisms. Obviously, they did those things in the very, very early church. Baptism, and you see that already in John the Baptist, and he baptizes Jesus, and he's been baptizing people, and then Jesus baptizes people. So it's something that you see very early on, and later in Acts, whole households are baptized. um, and in one of the early writings of the Church, the Didache, there's discussion of baptism, and there's discussion of Lord's Supper, of the Eucharist, and how that was performed in the early church. So it's something they've been thinking about a long time, but this term sacrament kind of over time has somewhat narrowed. In that regard, Brock, I recently, well, in the last few months, I had a discussion with a pastor, not my own pastor, but just a pastor, and we were talking a little bit, and we were making note of the fact that there seems to be a move um, to to be more sacramental in some ways, and to think more deeply about what that means. to think more deeply about the definition of it. And he said something that kind of surprised me for a Reformed pastor, which is, well, maybe we ought to think about whether there really are more than two sacraments. Not that there aren't, and he meant it in sort of Augustine's way of thinking about things, using that definition of a visible sign of an invisible grace. And his point was not so much, oh, we should go back to the Catholic way of doing things and marriage is a sacrament and extreme unction is a sacrament. No, not that. But he said we ought to tie, as if we're going to see the worship service as worship involving word and sacrament, maybe we can think of this broader view of what a sacrament is as a way to help people to understand the gospel. If a sacrament is a visible sign of an invisible grace, and if the gospel really is about the grace of God, can we look for other visible signs of this invisible grace? And can we incorporate that in some way? And can we incorporate that into how we do a worship service? Can we incorporate it into sort of the architecture of church buildings? Can we incorporate it into the way we sing and the way we pray and the way that we greet each other and all certain parts of the liturgy? And after I got over my initial like, what, you think there are more than two sacraments? I thought, well, yeah, when we speak of sacrament in that way, I think there is some value. Obviously, I think we still, as we follow our confessions, um, we still have to be careful about the specific sacraments of the Lord's Supper and of baptism, and our confessions, are very clear on certain practices that would be acceptable and certain that would not, and what the meaning of those things are. But if we sort of use this broader version of the word sacrament, yeah, maybe this is a good thing to be thinking about. How can we make clear to people, uh, how can we show them visible signs of God's grace, of grace of Christ that often seems invisible because it's not something you can physically see. It's not like, when you become a Christian suddenly, like on Pentecost, you don't suddenly have flames above your head. All Christians aren't, all saved Christians aren't walking around with little flames over their head. At least I don't have one, and I'm pretty confident. So what is, I think that is probably something good to think about. What did you think, Brock, of Augustine's definition of sacrament as a visible sign of an invisible grace, and how might that relate to our more narrow view that we have of the sacraments, specifically the Lord's Supper and baptism?
My friend, I like that definition, and I think an interesting question is why? Why did Augustine define it that way? What's the power? What's the virtue in such a thing? Why do we even need visible tokens? What does a wedding ring do anyway? I can imagine if wedding rings would glow when your spouse was in danger, or when a child would be threatened. You remember the Lord of the Rings movies. Bilbo had that little sword and it would glow blue when goblins and orcs were nearby. If if it was something like that, you could see the value of a token. But of course, our tokens don't glow. So what is the value? What's the purpose of it? And like so many things in theology, I think the value and purpose is the accommodation. Now, I think I can illustrate this by giving an example of something that a religious ritual that set up something that became sacramental for Old Testament Israel. So let me read from Deuteronomy chapter 27. Then Moses and the leaders of Israel gave this charge to the people: obey these commands I'm giving you today. When you cross the Jordan River, set up some large stones and coat them with plaster. Write this whole body of instruction on them when you cross the river to enter the land the Lord your God is giving you, a land flowing with milk and honey, just as the Lord, the God of your ancestors, promised you. When you cross the Jordan, set up these stones at Mount Ebal and coat them with plaster, as I am commanding you today. There, build an altar to the Lord your God using natural, uncut stones. You must not shape the stones with an iron tool. Build the altar of uncut stones and use it to offer burnt offerings to the Lord your God. Sacrifice peace offerings on it. Celebrate by feasting there before the Lord your God. You must clearly write all these instructions on the stones, coated with plaster. So, what's the point of this token? What's the virtue? Was there special magical powers in those stones? Could the initiated magic user cast a spell? Hocus pocus, alakazam, blah, 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 and vavavoom. I command you to grow 3 legs. Well, no. I think what we're looking at here is it's an accommodation to the fact that we as people, we forget. We are so easy to forget. And so the uniqueness of this altar was put there so that the people of Israel would walk by it on their way to work or on their way to the king's palace or on their way to wherever they were going about their business. They would see the altar and they would be able to refresh their minds from the writing that was on the altar. Oh, yeah, this is what happened to Granddad. This is what happened to our great grandpa. Yeah, just go down to the stones and you can check it out. So a new generation, one that wasn't there to witness the crossing of the Jordan and the exodus out of Egypt, one that wasn't there to witness the mighty hand of the Lord moving and acting, now all of a sudden can see in that physical object. So there's something about the physical token that just makes it easier for people to remember. And I think that's really the whole game. That's really the whole ball of wax, is the visible demonstrating the non-visible. And this is, you'll see this often in the scriptures. God will say something to the effect of, I fed you physically. Now, because I fed you physically, you can have faith. You can trust that I'm going to feed you spiritually. You know, I've taken care of you in the material things. So you can have faith and confidence that I'm going to take care of you in the non-material things, in the things that you can't see. You know, we joke, Chuck, about the state motto of Missouri being "Show me," and that's pretty famous. And Missourians are pretty well known for having that attitude of, if I can't see it, I don't trust it. And so that visible expression somehow anchors and gives blessing and power to the invisible thing. You know, we talked about the wedding rings. You know, one thing that can happen, and I'm sure does happen, is, you know, a husband and a wife can get into a fight. And Chuck, I hope I'm not scaring our audience by telling them something controversial here, but sometimes husbands and wives fight very aggressively. And one of the two or both can say to themselves, boy, I really thought that person I married loved me. And now I hear these words out of their mouth. I hear this anger out of their voice. But then they can look at that ring that's around their finger. And then they can, oh, yeah, I remember. Yes, he spoke harshly to me yesterday. But I also, from this ring, I remember him looking into my eyes and saying those vows. I will love you. I will honor you. I will cherish you all the days of my life. And so I think that's the essence of sacramentalism. It's an instrument, a grace, a means of grace or blessing. There's nothing special in the rocks themselves. There's not supernatural powers in this river or that river. Holy relics, their virtue is not that they contained a magical efficacy to them, but their virtue was that they were cherished items. Now, I'll give an example, Chuck, that almost everybody has in their home. I have it as well. And it's not called in the Far East, it's called an altar, a shrine to your elders. Now, we don't have that here in America very much. Very few people have a shrine to their elders, their ancestors, where they pray to mom and dad and grandpa and the people who came before. But almost everybody, once they get to a certain age, starts to just have a few little knickknacks, a few little tokens. I have with me right now. I don't know if you can hear this or not. Can you hear this, Chuck? It's a little tiny bell, and it's one of the last things I have from my late grandmother, who died in 1981. I have almost nothing from her still in my possession, but I have this little bell, and every now and then I'll just take it out and I think about her and I remember her. I lost my own mother 5 years ago this year, and it's much the same. Right after she passed, I had many of her things, and now it's only 5 years later, and Chuck, 5 years is not long, and already probably 2/3 to 3/4, maybe even 80 to 90% of the items that I had of hers have been disposed of, or they've reached their end of life, or they're not here. And so, just like I only have that little bell to remind me of my grandmother, it's the same thing with these fewer and fewer objects that my mother had in her possession, or that she gave to me as a gift. And so these visible signs unlock something special in our minds and in our hearts. And that's beautiful, that God would allow himself, that God would accommodate us in our finitude, in our creaturely limitation, in our smallness of mind, and in our forgetfulness. So I think, boy, the more I think about this, the more important sacraments can be. Now, having said that, there's one issue here that I want to make clear. You read the history of the sacraments, and what should be obvious is that there is no agreed upon definition of what the sacraments are. One theologian says this, another theologian says that, and still a third says something else. I remember as a young boy, after I came to Christ, I was in a Protestant church, and I asked, I said, is marriage a sacrament? And they looked at me and said, no, just baptism and the Lord's Supper. And I don't know why, but I was very crestfallen. Oh, I think marriage should be a sacrament. You're taking vows, you're asking for God's help, you're declaring um, intentions before God and asking Him to be a witness and asking for His grace and blessing. And, for a while I didn't understand why are my Protestant friends saying, well, marriage isn't a sacrament. And, I'm almost 50 years later now as a Christian. And Chuck, I can't tell you that I actually understand the reason why, other than the fact that I appreciate that Protestants came out of the icon controversies of the Middle Ages, in which tokens, physical tokens. Could you imagine if I rang this bell and I started to think that would bring the spirit of my late grandmother back into the room and I could have a conversation with her? That would be most unhealthy. But in the Middle Ages, that's what happened with relics. They became prized and coveted and even worshiped. And so when the Protestant Reformation happened, the reformers were so zealous to get rid of objects or physical items because of the temptation to idolatry, that the reformers took the path they took. And yet, like you said, Chuck, maybe the number could be different. So I very rarely get anathematized for having a different position here. So it's one reason why I like to talk about the sacraments with people. How is it for you, and where do you sort of fit on that category? And what do you think is the theological significance of these graces being administered in these visible public declarations?
Yeah, one of the things that I think is really important about the sacraments, and specifically about the sacraments that we in the Protestant tradition, the two sacraments that we say are key parts of what we do, is they really are, they really help us to see and understand important doctrines, because of, we as humans, we yeah, we can hear things and we can understand things, and that's why we have the sermon. We're listening to pastor give us the word, but we also do experience things through our sight and through touch, and obviously we're very concerned. You mentioned the struggles over icons and things like that, and so in especially in the Reformed tradition, we've been very careful about how do we use images and things like that. But the sacraments are a way for us to have sort of a physical representation of these doctrines. And so the water we use to wash, right? And so there's a picture of God's grace in washing away our sin, by the use of the water being put on the heads of those who are being baptized. Um, in my tradition, where we baptize infants, there's another part of it is the fact that we baptize these babies before they really even understand what's happening to them, and our pastor always, I may have mentioned this before, but as our current pastor always, as he speaks to the children who are up front, he will often ask them, the kids, hey, does this baby, so using the example of a child who was baptized maybe about 9-10 months ago, um, they would say, hey, Augie, is he able to say, hey, I believe in God and I love him and I want to be baptized? And the kids, they go, no, he can't talk, he's a baby, right? And the pastor will say, well, that's how it was with us as well. We're God saved us even before we even understood. who he was and what he could do for us. And there's nothing that we can do to add to our salvation, just as Augie, as a little baby who's just kind of sitting there letting the water get put on his head and kind of flailing about a little bit, that he can't add anything to it. He can't go and say, hey, let me grab some of this water and baptize myself. He can't participate in that. And so that's part of it there. And similarly in communion, um, while we don't believe like Catholics do that the bread literally becomes Christ's body and the blood and the wine or the juice literally becomes Christ's blood, we still do listen to what Christ said at the Last Supper when he said, "This is my body and this is my blood." There's something physical about being able to hold that bread and to hold the cup with the wine in it and to think about the sacrifice that Christ made. And even some of the traditions that we have, and another thing that we do, and it's a more recent tradition in our church, but it echoes, many churches have been doing this for centuries. But before we begin to walk up to the front for communion, we always repeat the words, Christ has died, Christ is risen, Christ will come again. And that repeating of those words is a regular reminder to us of who Christ is and what he's done, and that he is living. He died for our sins, but he rose again for our salvation, and now he it will come again to bring us into the new heavens and the new earth. And so these are all things that we do that help that remind us of these things. And so I think that's a really important piece of how we do things. And so then, even thinking about that broader definition, the more Augustinian definition of a sacrament as being a visible sign of an invisible grace, I think there are ways, obviously I wouldn't want to start saying, okay, well, anything and everything is a sacrament. Let's do all sorts of crazy things. But I think we can think about these lesser sacraments or these other sacraments or something in how do we do things. I am aware of a church in Colorado that designed their sanctuary. So they're in Colorado. They're in Colorado Springs, and so you've got the mountains. And they designed the sanctuary so that there's a window behind the pulpit, and you see the mountains, but it's frames it in such a way that the light then comes in and shines on the cross. And so as you're in the building, your eye is drawn because the light that comes in through that window, and you're seeing that beautiful creation, but then the light that you see from that window where you see that beautiful creation is designed to draw your eye now to the cross. And so that brings together the idea that God is the creator, Christ is the redeemer. And that's very clearly a part of why they designed things that way. And yeah, there was a man who was a member of our church. His wife passed a few years ago, and he's now moved to Michigan to be near his kids. But he was an architect, and his specialty was designing churches. And he was often very careful about how he designed things, and he would learn about the traditions of the churches that he was designing these churches for, to help him understand what are the symbols, what are the signs what are ways that I can make visible in the way that we're designing this building inside and out, that can really reflect your tradition's core values, and what are the things out of scripture that you really want to point out. And I remember him telling me one time that he really learned a lot. He became very popular. Now, there are a lot of Lutheran churches in Wisconsin, so that's part of it. But yeah, he designed a lot of Lutheran churches, and he says, I really learned a lot about the Lutherans because of sitting down with them before I would actually do any drawings. I would sit down with them and say, what are you looking for? What do you consider important? And it's kind of neat. And obviously, he did a good enough job that a lot of Lutheran churches hired him to design their churches, including some very large ones. So it's and it was really enjoy. I missed talking to him about that issue. I because of that discussion when I was teaching high school kids. Actually, I think I had both middle and high school kids. I was teaching them catechism and things like that. And I remember one lesson that we had where we just started. I don't even remember how I connected it, but it had something to do with thinking about who the church is. But I would put on the screen pictures of various churches, and I would and it was a guessing game. It was identify the Christian Reformed churches and our denomination, and you'd put up pictures on the screen, and the first group of them, it would be pretty obvious, right? A church that has, for example, the pulpit or the lectern over to the side. Well, that wasn't going to be a Christian Reformed church. There are many traditions that do that, but that's in the Christian Reformed tradition, you put the pulpit right in the middle of the upfront, or there we have in our tradition, there's the logo of the Christian Reformed Church is a triangle and a cross, and so that when that would show up in the picture, people would go, okay, I know that. And we also do sort of, it seems like so many Christian Reformed churches have this certain aesthetic, usually fairly, not a lot of stained glass, and usually more white light, and the pews kind of look the same. A lot of the churches actually look very similar. And then at the end, I would try to fool them and pick a few that looked like they might be Christian Reformed, but they weren't, and a few that didn't look like it but still are. And we spent then some time talking about what does the way we how, the buildings that we worship in, and then our liturgy and all that. What does that teach us about the message, about the word that's being preached? Well, in many ways, these are sacraments, and while they may not be the two sacraments that that we are very careful to protect and to do in the proper way, they're still, I think that way of thinking of sacraments that Augustine had, to see them as visible signs of visible grace. It's a good reminder that we need those visible signs. We, as human beings, we need to be able to see and touch and taste things that remind us of grace, and so that's a really important thing to be doing as we think about the sacraments. Now, Brock, we didn't really get to as far as I thought we might, and I don't know whether we'll we'll do some of this. We'll review the rest of the chapter at a later date or not. But before we finish up, I just wanted to ask: are there other is there another are there other topics related to this that you really wanted to make sure that we covered before we finish up for the evening?
Yeah, thank you, my friend. I think I'll share with our viewers. You and I have a thing for the for volumes in the Oxford Handbook series. So there's quite good theological content put out by Oxford University Press in the Oxford Handbooks of certain religious topics. For example, the one we're reading right now. One of the Oxford handbooks that I have been eyeing for about 2 years, I think it's about 2 years since it was published, is the Oxford Handbook of the Sacraments. Because what we just talked about tonight really just scratched the surface. And I think there's something important there about how you can tell much about the theology of a person or a group or a denomination by the sacraments they celebrate and affirm, by the manner in which they uh, practice them. And very oftentimes you can start to untangle difficult problems in other areas of theology by relating to them where they are sacramentally. So that's just a fancy way of saying, in many respects, sacramentology sometimes seems like it's a secondary topic that's, um, beyond some basics. It might not have amazing application for us today, but I think it's the exact opposite. So, uh, if anybody is looking to buy me my Christmas present, anybody hypothetically, Bueller, the Oxford Handbook of the Sacraments it is on my reading list there, and so I think there's a lot more interesting discussions to be had. I enjoyed the survey. I enjoyed some of the tie-ins here. Uh, you and I'll talk privately. We might just move on to some other chapters because we have so much material we want to get through. But this was a lot of fun, my friend. Let me throw it back over to you for our closing prayer.
Yeah, it was a lot of fun, and it's a topic that I like to talk about and think about, and um, I'm actually kind of known in my congregation as the guy who wants to do the Lord's Supper more often. People know that about me. I'm not the only one, but and it often comes up as a topic, and people will often, come to me if they've got questions about things related to that, because they know it's something that I'm interested in. I'm no expert necessarily, but something that I have a lot of interest in. So good to talk about this stuff, and yeah, let's go to God in prayer. Our Father in heaven, we praise you and we thank you because you are a God who not only speaks the word to us, but you have other ways of communicating to us as well. That you designed us as people with senses, and you've given us ways to understand you through those senses. And even as we think about the sacraments and how they are visible signs of invisible grace, and they're ways that you give us to help us understand the gospel, to understand the good news of salvation. I pray that as we have these discussions, and as Christians in many places talk about topics around the sacraments, that we don't forget that the sacraments aren't something that are created by humans, that are done only by humans, but the power in those sacraments comes from you. You are the power behind those symbols. You are the one who activates the those symbols so that they have power in our life. And so I just pray that we'll remember that, and rather than thinking of things like baptism and the Lord's Supper as just being ritual that we do in order to maybe gain favor, but rather we see them as visible signs of your grace. Now, Lord, be with us and be with all those who are listening and watching us as well. And